Tonight we're going to take a little bit different direction. I said last week I was going to talk about what? Everybody looked at me like, huh? The left hand of God? Did I say that last week? Yeah. I don't. Right, yeah. Yeah. I don't really expect people to remember anything I say, so not surprised. But at any rate, that's a weird phrase. Anybody familiar with it? Heard it before? Left hand of God? Okay, well, I'll explain it in a little bit, but as a little bit of background, what we've done in the first 3 weeks is really set the stage for this. And there's some key principles now that all come to bear to help us. And the first principle, and it sounds so basic, the world belongs to God, but we have to start there because that's fundamental to what God is doing. The world doesn't belong to us. We were given the responsibility with Adam and Eve of caring for it, ruling it, subduing it, but it's His world. And God, in His amazing way, delegates that kind of responsibility to His creatures, and He takes pleasure in that. And so in Scripture, it says the earth is the Lord's, and the Lord says, all the earth is mine. And while we would all say, yeah, we agree with that, we've thought about that, we've heard it before, sometimes I think it's easy to give lip service to something like that. Do we really believe that? And especially in the day in which we lived, I've never seen a time in my life like we're living in right now. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that like every 5 years, oh, this is the most amazing time or something. I'm really quite struck with what an unusual period of time we live in. And a lot of things that are happening call into question whether we really believe this or not. Does the earth really belong to God? And so we need to settle that in our minds because it changes the way we see so many of the issues that are happening today. The second principle, we saw this the first week. God intends to bless every ethnic group in His world. So if it's His world, then the people who live in His world are His as well. And we saw in our text in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, Joe taught on that God intends to bless all the families of the earth. So he says, this is my world. The people that live in it are my people. Pagans, unbelievers, idolaters, whatever they are, they're my people, and I intend to bless all of them. And so we saw that in Genesis 12, verse 3, and we can see that in the Great Commission where Jesus says to His disciples to make disciples of all nations, every ethnic group. And that's so important that we see that because that exposes God's heart a little bit. In Revelation 5 and 7, it's very intentional where it says that worshiping the Lamb around the throne are representatives from every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. And that's really a fulfillment of these two verses and other verses as well. That says, God says, this is what I want. And then in the end, Revelation 5 and 7, sure enough, that's who's there worshiping Him. Revelation 5, 9, 7, 9. So His world is His people. And what He does with the people in His world is up to Him. And so that leads us to our third principle, which is really a key to tonight. God moves the people in His world around intentionally so that they can be positioned to be blessed. If He wants to bless them, then would it not make sense that God would use His abilities and powers to put them in places where they can actually be blessed? And He would do that at strategic times. Now, I don't know if you thought about that idea or not, but that's really a pretty profound thought, and it surfaces in this passage in Acts chapter 17. Paul is preaching at Athens. He's preaching to pagans. These are idolaters. If you've ever read Acts 17 and that whole story of what he was trying to do with those guys, it's quite profound what he has to say. And he's trying to show that God's authority is over the peoples of the earth. And so he says that God made from one man every nation of mankind. This is actually a quote from Deuteronomy. Paul's drawing this out of Deuteronomy, where Moses says the same thing to the people of Israel as they're preparing to go into the land. They need to understand who these people are. These are the people where God decided that he would make of one man all these nations on earth. He determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling places. Is that not profound? Isn't that thought-provoking? Why did he do that? Verse 27, so that they would seek God, not just whimsically says, I think I'll put this group here and that group there, but he has intentionality. He wants to bless all the families of the earth, so he puts them in strategic places at strategic times so that they would seek him. This will facilitate their seeking the Lord and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. What an awesome thought. And what does that tell us about God? He not only says, I want to bless all the families of the earth, but he says, I'm going to do everything I can to position these people to actually receive blessing as well. He's not going to make it hard. It's already hard enough. It's a fallen world. But he's going to act in such a way that these people have a likelihood, if they're so inclined, that they can seek God. I don't know about you, but that just really makes me so excited to think about that, because now you begin to see this is God's work. It's God's mission, as we've been talking about. And he blessed Abraham with all the resources that he needed to do the work he was called to, which is to bless all the families of the earth. And so God does that, but also because his mission is so important to him, the recipients of that blessing, he actively works to put them in the right places at the right times. And that really is the background to what we're going to talk about tonight, that whole idea. And one more principle, the challenge of studying history is to see how God, in order to accomplish his grand purposes, worked with his left hand to facilitate the advance of the gospel. Okay, so I put the phrase left hand there. I haven't explained it yet, but we're coming to that idea. That is that God has a right hand and a left hand. I'll explain that in just a moment. With his left hand, he is working to put people in the right places and to create opportunity for people to actually seek him and find him. And for instance, in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel, remember, he's a captive. He's been deported from Jerusalem to Babylon for the rest of his life. He's going to live in Babylon. And so he's there under the Babylonian and then the Persian government. When Babylon falls to Persia, Daniel's still there. He rises to the top. And so Daniel says, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. Well, how much wisdom and power does he have? He goes on to say, it is he who changes the times and the epochs. All right? That's kind of what Paul was saying in Acts 17, wasn't it? That he's determined the times where people would live. So here God is involved in the times of human events. And, he goes on to say, and he removes kings and establishes kings. Okay, and that's pretty practical for people of all times, no matter where you live. You live under a dictatorship, you have no say in the vote. Well, God's got a say in that. You live in a democracy where people can vote. God's got a say in it as well. And so this puts a perspective on how God works that is really important for us to understand. So those four principles undergird what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, any questions on those four? Yes?
I think at least a couple of them had the word bless in them. I wonder if you could explain bless.
Well, bless, there's a lot of ways to explain it. And it's tricky because it's not only used of people being blessed, but we also say with the same word, bless the Lord, okay? Or bless, God is blessed. So the idea is that blessing is an enhancement. It's an empowerment. Okay, so when God said to Abraham in Genesis 12, I'm going to bless you, that means you got a task to perform, and I'm not going to expect you to do that without enablement, so I'm going to empower you. I'm going to enable you. I'm going to give the enhancements that you need to do the task. so that you can bless all the families of the earth. You can empower them. Remember, the condition that they're in is from Genesis 3 at that time. They're all under the curse. They're not empowered. They've been weakened. In the creation account, days 5, 6, and 7, God blessed his creation, which means he empowered the creation to do everything that he had wired into it. Everything it could do because he blessed it. Then when cursing came along, he imposed limitations on all of creation. That's the world we live in. It's got all these limitations. But he comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to empower you in a new way so that you can empower everyone else. And I'm going to restore this empowerment, this ability to achieve your full potential. Now, when we say that of God, we're saying that as a desire. That's a request. That's a longing of our hearts. Bless the Lord. I want God's infinite capacity of power to be unleashed. And so I bless him in that sense, for the release of his empowerment, that he will do everything he can and wants to do. And we could also say, when we bless him, that we're affirming that he does that as well. So I don't know if that helps or not. Yeah. So blessings then become not just empowerments, but they become resources to achieve a task or to fulfill a task. And so if we have blessings, like in Ephesians 1, Paul says that blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ. Those are resources. Okay, that's not just for our personal enjoyment. That's resources given to us, just like Abraham was given resources. It's almost a reaffirmation of what God said to Abraham in Genesis 12. I'm going to bless you. Paul says we have every blessing, every resource in the heavenly places as well, so that we have full enablement. There's nothing lacking. None of us lack anything in that sense to do the work that God has called us to do. Okay? Good question. All right, so with that as a background, let's talk about the left hand of God tonight. And I hadn't ever heard of this expression either until several years ago. A fellow spoke on it, and I began to dig into it a little bit and got really excited about it and saw how practical it is. It comes from Martin Luther. Martin Luther defined the spiritual ministry of the church and the proclamation of the gospel as the right hand of God. Okay, so the work of the church, evangelism, preaching, teaching, these elements are the right hand of God. So then obviously, if he's got a right hand, does he have a left hand? Yes, he does. And he said the left hand of God is how God uses culture and government and society and earthly institutions to restrain evil and to enable his right hand to succeed. Okay? So that's a simple definition of the idea. Does that make sense? Everybody see that God is working in two spheres then. His church is his primary agent to do his work, but to enable that to happen, he works through all the things that are going on in the world to facilitate the work of the church. So whatever we're doing as a church, churchONE or any church, whatever we're doing, we are doing that, and sometimes unbeknownst to us, God is busily at work arranging government, culture, people, institutions, all of these things to facilitate the work that we do. That's the idea with the left hand of God. So we can then ask some questions. It becomes very practical. How does God do this? How does God do his work with his left hand to pave the way for the church to work? And especially next week when Joe teaches, he's going to teach on Jesus coming. You going to do the apostles too, or okay? You're gonna drive here in your new Porsche that everybody can see. Okay, all right. So that'd be exciting. If the doors open wide enough, we could bring it right in here. Maybe that'd be cool. Wish I could be here for that. But anyway, Joe's going to talk about how the world of first century AD was prepared by God ahead of time through things that were happening for centuries. That's what we're going to look at tonight. How did God get the first century world ready for the coming of the Messiah? Remember, this is the big deal that the tension in the Old Testament is building over. If you read it as a story, tension is rising. It's moving there's a rising, ascending kind of action in the story that it's going to come to a climax. And that climax, in one sense, is going to be the coming of the Messiah. And he's critical because he's the one prophesied in Genesis 3:15. It's going to crush the head of the serpent. Everybody wants the serpent's head crushed. When's the seed going to come? Well, that's what's happening in the Gospels. And as the New Testament opens, the question is, how did God work through his left hand to prepare the world for that to take place? And if we can see him doing that then, how does it work today? Is it possible God is still working with his left hand in the world today? Through elections, through good presidents in the United States, through bad presidents, good Congresses, bad Congresses, governors and mayors and councils and all of this, and all around the world. How is God facilitating the work that he is determined to accomplish through these kinds of things? That's the question that we ask. Now we can see how in the Old Testament God has always used the secular nations to accomplish his purposes. And we can kind of back up and look and see how that played itself out. Remember Genesis 3:15, the serpent head is going to get crushed by the seed of the woman. Question is, how is that going to happen? And we wait for something to happen. We read through Genesis 3 through 11, nothing's happening. And then we come to Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, and we see that God is going to launch Israel, and this is his right hand then stepping in. Remember, the right hand is the proclamation. It's the work that he does through his people. Okay? So now we see God's right hand coming into the story in Genesis 12, 1-3. And from that point on, Israel is on mission. That's what we looked at last week, right? Queen Sheba coming to Solomon, Naaman becoming converted. All of that is a direct result of what God did with Israel to position them to be in the right place to bring blessing. Now Israel's on mission through the Old Testament. So how did that play out? Well, we look at God's left hand. His left hand was active as well throughout the Old Testament. So we can see that, for instance, with the nation of Egypt. God was working through Egypt. Right from the beginning, before Genesis is over, God has already raised up this nation to do certain things, to accomplish certain purposes. Okay, and it's not just punitive for Israel. There's also other reasons that we don't have time to talk about where God raised up the nation of Egypt and allowed Israel to become in bondage to them. And then through the conquest, we see the Edomites and the Amalekites and the Canaanites and the Moabites and these different peoples all having influence on Israel as they are seeking to come from Egypt and through the wilderness to the land of Canaan. They opposed, they helped. God's using these peoples to accomplish his purposes. We come to the book of Judges, and we've got the Philistines are a major force, okay, and for good or for ill. And so we see their presence as well. So all along the way, as we're looking at the right hand of God with the nation of Israel on mission, we see the presence of the left hand of God doing things amongst these nations. And so it's not like it's a new thing because it's there, it's kind of present everywhere. And so what I want to do now is give 6 evidences for the work of God with his left hand throughout the centuries to bring the Mediterranean world to a place where the Messiah can come and accomplish his work. Okay, so we'll go through these, and as questions arise, we'll tackle them. The first of which is the deportations by Assyria and Babylon. We're familiar with the captivities, talked about them a little last week. Remember I gave you that diagram that showed the northern and southern kingdoms. We'll use that tonight as well so we can understand what God was doing. But these deportations were critical. Not just what we might think to punish Israel, but God's doing other things. And that's the amazing thing. We get so honed in on one thing that's happening. And we can easily miss the fact that there's a big picture and a big world. You know, like when the election was coming up, everybody's talking about the election as if the whole earth is revolving around an election here. And even in our country, God is doing all kinds of other things, let alone around the world. So we begin to really get an amazing view of God. And so what this did then was it moved the Jews from relative isolation, forced them to go out into the world and live in close proximity to Gentiles. Let me shut my phone up here. Well, how did that work? Let's go back to our little timeline. We've got the right hand of God there. Genesis 12, 1-3. Israel is on mission. How is God going to work to accomplish this thing of getting his people in close proximity to Gentiles? What's SDS? Yeah. Saul, David, Solomon. Yeah. So we did that last week. I knew you would remember that. Saul, David, and Solomon. Then, in 931, at the death of Solomon, the kingdom divides into the northern and southern kingdom. Okay, this is still the right hand of God, remember, because this is the people of God. These are his missionary agents. So we're looking at his right hand. Even in their failure through the division of the kingdom, still his right hand. And no matter what happens, Israel, through the Old Testament, was still his right hand. And then we look at his left hand coming into the picture. Okay, so and when we read the Old Testament, we get caught up in one or the other. Sometimes we're focused on the Assyrians or Israel, the Babylonians or Israel. But both are working together because God is at work. And so as his right hand is at work through Israel, he is also working with his left hand amongst the Gentiles. And so we see the exiles coming. And the first exile was in 722. The Assyrians emerged as an empire. So we see the rising of the Assyrian Empire in the 9th century BC, and their collapse in 612 when the city of Nineveh was destroyed. That's the end of the Assyrian Empire. But while they were in their heyday, what did they do? They took Israel into captivity, and God speaks of Assyria as the rod of my right hand. In other words, Israel sinned, they're going into captivity, but God has a rod in his hand that he is going to punish his people with. The rod is Assyria, which means Assyria by itself is nothing. God is using Assyria to accomplish a purpose. Amazing thing is that Assyria never recognized that. And so later on, God will say of Assyria, you did my work that I raised you up to do, but you're proud and you're arrogant about it. So now I'm going to bring you down by someone else. So I'm going to punish you for punishing my people by bringing someone else along that will punish you. And so this is the presence of Assyria. And then Babylon in 586 comes along. And so God says, I'm going to punish you, Assyria, for punishing my people. I'm going to use Babylon to punish you. And then I'm going to punish Babylon. Because Babylon also took credit for it, did it in their own strength. They were arrogant and lifted up and proud. And in 539, the city of Babylon also gets destroyed. So we see these empires rising and falling throughout the Old Testament. It's fascinating then to then you read the prophets. Sometimes it seems really confusing, but it's really talking about this kind of stuff. So we look at this map, call this the diaspora. What's that word mean? Yeah, right. We get what English word from it? Dispersion, yeah. The Greek, this is a Greek word, diaspora, which we get our word dispersion from. So this is the dispersion of the people of God throughout the Old Testament. And so we can look at Jerusalem and see the location there, and then the blue lines represent Israel being diffused out, dispersed out throughout the empire. And then, in particular, we look at Daniel's deportation in 606 BC. Daniel's deportation is the kind of the one that we're most familiar with, even though lots of other people were deported as well. And he's going to be taken to the city of Babylon. Now, in itself, that may not seem so significant. Like, what's the left hand of God doing here, we would ask? What does this accomplish? Is it merely to punish those Israelites for their idolatry? Daniel didn't do anything wrong. He just seems to be a godly man. What's he doing there? And so we need to ask that question and try to figure out what God is up to in this kind of thing. And what this really did then was it moved the Israelites out among the nations. Because remember, we looked at Deuteronomy 4 last week. The nations are going to watch what you do. They're going to see the way you live in obedience to the law. And then as they see that, they're going to marvel at God's law and who God is. But you have to be among them. You have to be able for them to see you. So this really is going to give the nations an opportunity to see them. It's a painful way for that to happen. But even when they were dispersed through the captivities, all the places that they went, they still went with the law. There was a lot of repentance that happened. They realized that this was happening because of their sin. So there was a lot of repentance. And we find out that the Jewish people maintained some cohesion through all of this. And Daniel's a great representative of this. Look at the impact that he had upon the Babylonian Empire during his time there. And it was interesting. I studied at Baltimore Hebrew University for a number of years. And various courses, these topics would come up, and I'd get their particular perspective. And one of the things they said that I had never known was that into the 20th century, the strongest Talmudical schools in the world were in Babylon. And they showed the history of how you could trace that back to Daniel's influence and the presence of the study of the law of God there, and the learning and all the rest that were happening there. And so this is really quite a powerful thing, where God is making himself present among the Gentiles in a most unusual way. Now we can tie that in with the destruction of Babylon by Persia in 539. Begin to see what is happening. Remember now, we've got, by the time of 539, we got Jews dispersed everywhere. They're not just in Babylon. That's a focal point, but they're everywhere. The Assyrians just moved people around willy-nilly. They didn't care. They disrupted families, separated husbands and wives, took children one way, all of this, and they took them everywhere because they were conquering all kinds of land. So wherever they would conquer, they would move conquered people into Israel and other places. They'd move Israelites out to these other places. So you got this mixing of all of the nations, and the moving in of the Gentiles led many of the northern kingdom of Israel to marry these Gentiles and produce what group of people? Yes, that's where the Samaritans come from. It was a direct result of the Assyrian captivity and the importing of Jews or Gentiles into Israel. So we see then the emergence of the kingdom of Persia. It's easy to remember these first three nations because they're all in alphabetical order. So it's not that complicated, I guess. And Persia in 539 destroys the city of Babylon and becomes the dominant world power. Now, notice the strategy. Assyria, they just wanted to humiliate, debase, and destroy the morale of the people that they conquered. Babylon comes along and says, we just want to deport you, and we're going to take you all to Babylon. You can build houses and have children and plant vineyards and all the rest and have a nice captivity. You'll be there anyway, Jeremiah says, for 70 years, so make the best of it. Persia comes along and says, man, this is complicated. We got all these conquered people everywhere. Why don't we just let them all go back home? And at that point, Judah and Jerusalem was a total disaster. And so the Persian government would then say, we're not going to get any economic value out of Judah and Jerusalem in this condition. Why don't we let them go back and rebuild it, and then they can have an economy? And so it wasn't for kind purposes or religious purposes. They simply wanted Judah and Jerusalem to be more productive so the Persian government would have less of a drain on their economy. They were so determined that they actually funded the return of the Jews. They budgeted for it. People like Nehemiah were on salary in the Persian government. And so they paid their fees in order to accomplish this. Where was God in that? We think of where was God when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel? Where was God when the Babylonians took the Judeans captive? Where was God when The Persians said, you guys can go back home, and we're going to help you do it, and we're going to give you the money to do it. Isn't that an interesting turn of events as it happened? And in all of that, we're asking, what is this accomplishing in God's larger purposes? So Persia destroyed the city of Babylon in 539. They moved the capital to a city called Susa nearby. And from there, then, they said to all the Jews, you can go back home. You can go back to your homeland. And so they all are going to return home, or many of them are going to, thousands of them, over a number of years. All with the financial support and backing of the Persian government. Until you read Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, you read those books, and you can read the story of how all of that plays out. It's very intriguing. But now the Jews are back home. When the New Testament opens up, what's going on in the land of Israel? Well, you got the Jews there. How did they get back there? You got the temple under construction. It's been rebuilt a little bit by Zerubbabel and then some by Nehemiah. And throughout the close of the Old Testament, they're working on this project. And then the New Testament opens and they have a temple. It's not perfect, and Herod's building it some, but they're there. They're reestablished. How did that happen, and how important is that for the work of the Messiah? So we see that the city of Susa becomes the capital of Persia, and then the Persian government says to the exiled Jews, you guys can all go back. As many of you that want to, and they appointed people like Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah to lead these groups back. So now they're all returning back, thousands of them, to their homeland. So when the Old Testament closes, that's where we are. Now, it's not a great picture, but it's a better picture, because now we got the Jews back where they belong, and we're getting prepared for the opening of the New Testament. And as I already said, Persia actually financed all this. Nehemiah gets accused of wrong motives, and he says, listen, the salary that the king of Persia was paying me, I never even took it. I'm the governor, I'm on the payroll, but I never used it for my own purposes. And so we can see then how the Persian government was really behind this, and how God had moved them to allow the Jews to return home. And so all of this then gets the Jews in their homeland. It gets them reestablishing the religious practices, establishing leadership, figuring out how they're going to do things. And so the New Testament is going to open in that kind of context. And when you read the New Testament, sometimes you can miss this. All this travail and movement around that's happened. We come to the New Testament, we've got Jews in Judea and Palestine, and we think, well, that's great. Never perhaps wondering, how did they get there? What did God do to accomplish this? Because he moved them all out pretty much. Now he's moving them all back. And that's the hand of God, because he establishes the times and the boundaries of peoples. And he moves people around for his purposes. While they were gone, was something accomplished. We'll see in a moment just what God did when the Jews were all dispersed. When they came back, was something accomplished as well. So think for a moment about how Persia influenced the events that brought Israel back. In 539, the city of Babylon is destroyed by Persia, and immediately they tell the Israelites, that the Jews, they can go back. So there's 3 returns. 3 groups come back. The first one is led by Zerubbabel, and that story is told in Ezra 1 through 6. All right, and so it talks about how he came back and how his goal was to rebuild the temple. And indeed, he succeeded in large degree, and within 20 years or so, the temple was being dedicated. Now, I don't know if that strikes you as important, but that's a really impressive thing. Not that it's just that they did it, but that now Israel has their temple. They've got their place of worship. God is restoring that for them. And so Israel now has a basis for the restoration of religious practices, the priesthood, all of the things that are important to the spiritual life of Israel. And during that time when they struggled, God raised up two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah in particular, who would help them. They got discouraged. They stopped working. God said, it's so important to God that he sent Haggai and Zechariah as their cheerleaders to help them out. Then we have intervening the story of Esther. She comes between Ezra 6 and 7. That story is right in the middle there. And so we plug that in. That's a great story of how Persia was dealing with the Greeks and trying to advance their kingdom and getting defeated at Greece. And you've read some of the great stories of Marathon and all the Spartans fighting back and all the rest. That happens during this time period. And then we have the second return under Ezra. And that's in Ezra 7 through 10. And Ezra comes back to build the people. He's a people kind of person. He's a disciple maker. He's a Bible teacher. He's a trainer. It's fascinating to read about him because he's actually a contemporary with the next guy, Nehemiah, who comes about 14 years later. So there, Ezra's been there for about 14 years. What's he been doing? Well, the city doesn't look any better. When Nehemiah shows up, you know the story. If you've read Nehemiah, it's a disaster. And so they come, Nehemiah comes and says, this place is a mess. And so he determines to rebuild it. What's Ezra been doing for 14 years? Well, he hadn't been building. He's not a builder. Nehemiah is. What Ezra's been doing has been training people and preparing leaders, because once Nehemiah gets things underway, there's the need for a revival. There's a spiritual movement. Who's going to lead this? He calls Ezra in. And Nehemiah can't lead a revival, and Ezra can't build a wall. They each have their gifts, and so he calls Ezra in, and Ezra's got all the small groups already organized. He's got leaders, and everything's right the way it should be. And this is how God was working during this period of time, and it was then that he raised up the prophet Malachi also to speak to the people. So God is at work. That's the thing that I want us to see tonight. Through all of this, God is doing something, and we want to know, if God did it then, is he doing it now? What is he doing now in our lives? That brings us to the third element. This is when the synagogue began to emerge in the Mediterranean world. I can't tell you how crucial this is to our understanding of how God was at work. Because with the Jews dispersed everywhere, what are they going to do? How are they going to worship? Are they just going to get assimilated into Gentile culture? Well, everywhere they went, they formed synagogues. And it was during this time that the synagogue gradually emerges. And it would become a place, an outpost for the Jewish people in a Gentile world, where Gentiles could observe the Jews at worship and could actually be drawn in to their worship as well. The Jews had a rule that if you want to establish a synagogue, you need 10 families. So wherever there was 10 families, they would start a synagogue. And Gentiles would observe this. And so then we have, by the opening of the New Testament, a group of people called God-fearers. God-fearers. And we see them in the book of Acts. Who are these God-fearers? These are Gentiles who have come in contact with faithful Jews, and in many cases they've been proselytized out of pagan Gentile idolatry and religion into the Jewish faith. They're not Christians, but they're on their way because they've already been brought under the influence of the Old Testament, and they're picking up some of the spirit of the Jews. And so this is what's happening through the presence of synagogues. So you can see that in the first century A.D., what is going on. In Rome, there's like 60,000 Jews in Rome. There's so many that they're getting kicked out of Rome. One of the emperors passed an edict that all Jews had to leave Rome because there were so many of them, and this was from the dispersion. I mean, how did 60,000 Jews get to Rome? We would want to ask. And the answer is, I'm not looking for any one answer. I mean, how did 60,000 Jews get to Rome? It's the D word. Yeah, it's the dispersion. I mean, that's all it is. And we marvel then when Paul writes to the church at Rome, There's 60,000 Jews there. There's 1 million people there. It's the largest city in the Roman Empire. So this is phenomenal to think that that many Jews would be living in the city of Rome in the 1st century A.D. But it's not just Rome. We can go down to Egypt. There are 1 million Jews in Egypt. Can you imagine? In the 1st century, 1 million Jews. What kind of influence does that have? But even more importantly, how did they get there? I just think these are really important questions because this sets the tone for the coming of the Messiah, the ministry of the apostles as they begin to spread the gospel. City of Alexandria in Egypt is the 2nd largest city, and it has 600,000 residents, 75,000 Jews just in that city. Had the largest library in the world, 2nd largest city in the Roman Empire in the 1st century, 75,000 Jews. Then we could take the city of Antioch. Okay, and we know about that because that's where Paul launched his missionary trip in Acts 13 and following. And it's a large Gentile city. It's the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire in the 1st century. How strategic is that to the work that's going on in Acts 13 and the launching of missionary journeys by Paul? That's a Gentile city. That's a Gentile church, by and large. Makes the leaders in Jerusalem church really nervous because they're not accustomed to seeing a church that's primarily Gentiles. And so there's 25,000 Jews there. And then you've got in Jerusalem, you've got residents of 40,000 people. Probably the bulk of them are Jews in the 1st century A.D. All of this is just to say, take a look at what the world was kind of like in the days when Jesus shows up and when the apostles launch out. This is the kind of world they came into. And we want to know what was going on with these Jews, wherever they were. If they lived anywhere in Italy, if they lived in Greece, if there's Jews in Greece, what's going on with them? And you notice every time Paul goes to anywhere, he visits a synagogue. Well, how do all these synagogues come into existence? Philippi, there's a synagogue. Corinth, there's a synagogue. There's synagogues in Athens. As we'll see later on, in Jerusalem alone in the 1st century, there were over 300 synagogues in the city of Jerusalem. I mean, this is a massive movement that has taken place. And we ask, where did it all begin? It all began with the dispersion. This triggered all kinds of other things that were going to go on with the Jewish people. And so we could say that by the 1st century there were God-fearers in every town because there were synagogues in every town. These God-fearers are Gentiles who are being drawn to the Jewish faith. They're finding something about it that's appealing. They don't like the Roman or Greek mythology of the gods, and so they're drawn to the Jewish faith for whatever reason, but they like it, and then we come to Acts and got a guy like Cornelius in Acts 10. It's called a God-fearer. He's just praying, seeking God. He's come under the influence of the Jews. Some of these, like Roman centurions, they're giving money to build synagogues. They're so favorably disposed to the Jewish people. This is what's happening in the 1st century. So nearly every town in the Roman Empire then has a synagogue by the 1st century. And you can see in Acts 6, for instance, there are alternative synagogues. Acts 6, verse 9. Okay, I said that there was over 300 synagogues in Jerusalem in the 1st century. This is one of them. And all it is for a select group of people. Just like we have churches that attract certain kinds of people, synagogues did the same kind of thing. All right. Now, I'm going to stop here for a moment because I've said a lot, and maybe a lot of this is new. I want to see, what are you picking up on? What are you hearing? Are you getting any ideas of what is going on here and how God is at work?
One thought I had was, growing up, I always thought of you had Saul, David, and Solomon, and everything else after that felt like a failure.
Mm-hmm.
To greater or lesser degrees, with some exceptions, but it felt like that plan wasn't working.
The plan after the division of the kingdom, you mean?
If Israel's mandate, how can they have these
Right.
failed governments but be succeeding in their mandate?
Yeah, sure.
something still going on with people,
Sure.
not just the name.
Yeah.
There was some substantive
Yeah.
organization, learning and teaching
Yeah.
that was capable of fulfilling a mandate.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of that was grassroots. You know, when the prophets write, they talk about how the priests have abandoned their calling, how the prophets are prophesying lies. The shepherds of the nation are failing the people. But underneath all that, there was this remnant of people who really...
But you can still produce a Daniel somehow.
Yes, right, yeah. And even before the division, Saul, David, and Solomon, man, they had some terrible skeletons in their closets too. By the time Solomon dies, he's a total failure. By the time David dies, he's a bitter old man who's completely botched his family life. All his kids are killing each other and hating him and hating one another. And I mean, it's not a pretty picture, but God is at work through the people.
I almost feel like, I don't remember the exact words, but I feel like before the first king, like the people wanted a king, but it didn't seem like it was, this is the childish interpretation of it, but like God didn't necessarily want him to have a king, but they asked for a king, so he kind of allowed it. That's kind of that's my recollection. It's almost like they're the first kingdom to rise and fall. You know, in addition to Assyria and that, it's like, you can have your little thing for a little while. It's going to rise and fall. It's going to serve my purpose.
Yeah. Well, the reality is God always expected, before there was ever a king, we have prophecies in Deuteronomy and Numbers that there will be, in Genesis, that Israel will have a king. So that was not the problem. The problem was that they wanted their kind of king on their timetable, on their terms. And they were not prepared to wait for God to choose a king. So they chose, God gave them Saul, but it wasn't his choice. He let them have their way. And so, it was more that kind of thing than God never wanted them to have a king. He expected them to have a king. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Any other thoughts before we move on? Yeah.
I just want to come back to your original kind of premise and the whole idea of the right hand and left hand. It's almost as though we're creating and I know you're not doing this, some kind of a dichotomy here where we have the spiritual and the secular. And it's all redemptive work.
Yeah.
Do it. So I don't think we want to go there. Can you help me avoid?
Yeah. I mean, it's recognizing that there's a difference between the people of God and those who are not the people of God. Okay, these are two different groups of people. The people of God are the ones who have the blessings and the resources and the mandate to bless everybody else. Those who are not the people of God are the ones that God uses and wants them to be impacted, and so he uses their institutions of government and culture and whatever to position them to be influenced by the people of God. So, pardon?
He's using both. I mean, he's using the non-Israelite and Israelite people both, right?
I'm not here. Oh, using them, yes. Oh, yeah. But the desire is for those who do not have the blessings, that is, the non-believers, the non-Jews, that they would come into contact with the Jews in a way that they can be blessed. The dichotomy is there are two groups of people. Okay? And I'm not saying there's some things that are secular and some things that are sacred or anything like that. Right, yeah. If you plant a tree in the will of God, that's a sacred act. All right? If you preach a sermon in the will of God, it's a sacred act. Whatever we do for God is sacred and holy. Okay? Good question. Right.
You know, it makes me think of, in a contemporary setting like the refugee crisis, these people are being brought to our front door, really.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, from all over.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Does this not, and as we'll progress through the next couple of parts of this, it really has enormous implications for people of any age, but especially what's happening in our world today. Yeah. All right, number 4, the spread of Hellenism. What's Hellenism? Greek culture. The spread of Hellenism enormously impacted the Mediterranean world. All right, so this is another significant feature. We've had Assyria, risen and fallen. Babylon, risen and fallen. Persia, risen and falling. Alexander the Great comes along, and he's just a flash in the pan, but man, what he does in a few years, conquers the entire known world, extends the Persian government all the way to India, and is threatening to come across to Greece. This is an amazing thing that happens, but it's not just geographical. So we look at and see where they come into the picture as well, and the apex of his reign is around 333 A.D. And so what did the Greeks do? What did they accomplish? Well, there's some ways that they impacted. One was through thought, philosophy, and worldview. All right. Every nation, every empire has a worldview. So the Assyrians had one. The Babylonians had one. They're very similar. The Persians had one. Very similar in a lot of ways. Greeks come along, totally different. They're non-Asian. They're a European continent. And just being across in Europe, right away they come with a different way of seeing things, and they contribute to the world of philosophy and thinking and logic and all of this kind of thing. In addition, they create a spirit of nationalism because they do not want to be Asian, and Persia's coming after them, and that's an Asian country, and so they have to mobilize. They've got their government, which is kind of a novel creation of city-states, and they have to coalesce them to get them to be strong enough to, as a nation, resist Persia and others who are attacking them. So the rise of nationalism is a contribution then of the Greek government, and then we have the almost worship of the human body. They were so enamored with the body itself. Exercise. We get our word gymnasium from the Greek. What's that literally mean? Anybody know what the word gymnasium means? It means to be naked. The Greek word gymnazo is to be naked. What's the connection? They exercise naked. They did the Olympics, no clothes on. All of that. That's because the human body is so great. We love the human body, so they didn't want to cover it up, and so they did all the different Olympic events with no clothes on, and they go to the gymnasium and exercise naked because they wanted to put the human body on display because they really loved it. And so this was a huge offense to the Jews as well. You've got at the death of Alexander the Great, his kingdom divides into 4 parts, and one of his kings takes over Palestine. He immediately begins instituting all the Greek things that he likes. The nudity, the eating of pork, sacrificing pork in the holy place in the temple, putting an image of Zeus up on the wall of the temple. All of this was being done. This was part of Greek culture. And they didn't have a problem with it because they liked all the gods. All the gods were really great. So why can't we add Zeus to Yahweh? Was kind of their thinking. Language. The Greek language, as we'll see in a moment, the Greek language virtually took over the Mediterranean world, became the language of communication. Aramaic had become that to a degree, but Aramaic, which is much like Hebrew, kind of faded away because it was a different kind of language, and in Europe you're not going to be speaking a Semitic language, so Greek became the dominant language. And then we have literature, the contributions of literature and art, and of course theology and religion, the mythology of the Greeks. All of this was shaping the modern world of the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament. And so when the New Testament is written, ultimately some of it was written in Aramaic, but all of it that we have is originally in Greek. That was the dominant language of the day. And that was the contribution then of Greece. So you can see on this little map, kind of see, I guess, the movement of the Greek Empire all the way to the Indus River in India. That's way beyond any of the boundaries that the Persian Empire ever had. And all the way down through Egypt, down into Ethiopia and Eritrea and over North Africa, and then all the way to Italy as well, or to Greece. So it was quite impressive. And when we come to the New Testament, we read the Gospels and Acts, it's filled with stuff that show the Hellenistic influence. Think of one problem that occurred in the book of Acts. Remember in Acts 6, there was a dispute of the widows. What was the real problem there? Yeah. Yeah. Who was getting taken care of and who wasn't? Who was in charge of the feeding of these widows? You guys got to go? Okay. All right. Who was in charge of the feeding of the widows? It was the apostles, right? Okay, so they're in charge of this thing. And then you've got two groups of widows. What are they? Yeah, you got Jewish and non-Jewish, but they're delineated more than just by ethnicity. You've got Greek-speaking Jewish widows and Hebrew-speaking Jewish widows. See, that's the point of tension there. What is reflected in the fact that there are some widows who are speaking Greek? What's that tell us about what's happening in Judaism? And of course, others are still speaking Hebrew. So what we're seeing then is a movement within Jerusalem in the church of some of the Jews towards a Hellenistic lifestyle. You know, and then they're raising their kids. Their kids, if they don't know Hebrew, their kids surely are not going to know Hebrew. And so it's like what we see in America. You know, you got a family that say comes from Korea. They barely know any English. In their home, they speak Korean. Their kids grow up speaking Korean, but then their kids have to go out to school. They learn English. They speak English out there. They come home, they speak Korean. They get married and have kids. They're not speaking Korean in their home. They're speaking English. Before you know it, Korean is gone. This is what's happening in Judaism in the first century. So the dispute is between Jewish widows, some of whom speak Greek, and therefore have been Hellenized, and some who speak Hebrew. Does that make sense? Okay. And because the apostles are in charge, Jewish males, Hebrew-speaking males, the Greek-speaking Jewish widows feel they're being slighted. They're not getting fair treatment because there's prejudice towards these Hebrew-speaking Jews. Okay? I know that sounds confusing when you try to explain it all, but get the idea. Okay? So that shows us then that the first century church is being impacted by this spread of Hellenism. And there's occasions where Paul is speaking to a crowd and then he switches to Hebrew. Right away they notice. You know, so this bilingual kind of thing that's happening in the world is really of great significance to the people and how they actually are living their lives and ministering. That brings us to number 5, the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek in the 2nd century BC. What do we call this translation? Anybody familiar with the term? Yeah, this is a Septuagint, which stands for 70. That's Latin for 70, and so it's often abbreviated LXX, the Roman numeral 70. And so this happened in the 2nd century BC, and it ties in directly with what we were just talking about. You know, this problem that is emerging in the 1st century. What issues led to the need for this? Well, we just talked about this, okay? We got the dominance of the Greek language, the loss of ability to speak the Greek language or the Hebrew language amongst the Jews, the presence of Greeks in the synagogues. They're coming in, they don't know Hebrew. You know, if the service is in Hebrew, they're reading the scriptures in Hebrew, what good is that? And so these are some of the issues that shape this decision. This is beyond my words to tell you how big this decision was and the impact that this had in the 1st century. What effect would this have on the Jewish synagogue and community? Now you have the scriptures, which they've only ever known in Hebrew, now you've got it in Greek. What kind of things do you think are going to happen in the Jewish community in the synagogue as a result of this?
Tradition
Yeah, sure. Yeah, all kinds of tension. It's like, I don't know if any of you are former Catholics, but they went from the Latin Mass to the English Mass. Whoa, man, that was huge. Well, that's the same kind of thing that's happening here as well. Some are going to be delighted, obviously. If you're a Gentile, you don't speak Hebrew, you're going to love this. Because this is putting the Word of God, the Old Testament, the Torah, in the language of the people for the very first time. And if this can be widely distributed, it can have an enormous impact. How would this impact the non-Jewish world? Well, we just said, now they have access to God's Word. How does this impact the apostles in the first century as they preach the good news? There's a lot of quotations in the book of Acts in sermons from the Old Testament. And so when Paul or Peter or anybody, like day of Pentecost, Peter stands up and preaches, and he quotes from Joel or somewhere. Where's he going to take that quotation from? He's not going to switch over to Hebrew. He's preaching in Greek. He's going to switch over to Hebrew to quote the Old Testament? No, he's going to quote right from the Septuagint. And in fact, in seminary we had classes where we compared the wording of New Testament quotations. And we looked at the Hebrew and we looked at the Old Testament Greek to try to figure out, most of the time when the apostles or Jesus quoted the Old Testament, were they quoting from the Hebrew or from the Greek? And the conclusion was the predominance were from the Septuagint version. They were quoting from the Greek version. Okay? So that tells us how widely distributed it was, how well known it was. This is a kind of a snapshot of Psalm 1 in the Hebrew Masoretic text. This is just to illustrate the difference. This is what it would look like. And if you're a Gentile, that might as well be Chinese or just scribbles. It's utterly meaningless. And here is what the Greek text of Psalm 1 would look like. Now, you may not know either Hebrew or Greek, so it may not mean a whole lot, but you can see right away that one is much more likely to be learned and understood by us than the other. And this is what is confronting the first century when they did already speak this language right here. So now they've got access to God's law in their own language. So we see this in Bible translation today. You can go and you can try to communicate things, but when you can put it in the heart language of people. And I have a friend who works in Eastern Europe, and so he works amongst the Roma gypsies. And they have a language that the gypsies he worked among are called the Bayash. So they've got their dialect called the Bayash dialect. But they have to, they go to school and they're out in the wider society. Everybody speaks Serbian. So they have to learn Serbian. But that's not their heart language. Their heart language is Bayash. And the only Bible they had was in the Serbian language also. So he comes in and he's working with them and he realizes they don't have the Word of God in their own language, and he proceeds to launch this Bible translation project, and they get portions of the Bible in the Bayash language, and he says the amazing response of people when they can read the Bible in their own language is just phenomenal. And that's what's happening because of the Septuagint. So this was initiated in Alexandria in Egypt. It was a great learning center, largest library in the world in the first century was in Alexandria in Egypt. And scholars got together, not for necessarily spiritual purposes, like they said, we want to see all the families of the earth be blessed, so let's do this project. They just thought it was going to be a good one to do, and so they did it. And the result was that the Word of God spread throughout the entire Mediterranean world. Now, if we backed up for a second to the 8th, 9th century BC, what happened back there? What was the first thing that happened? We're talking about 6 evidences of God's working. What was the first thing that happened? Yeah, the dispersions. The Syrians and the Babylonians. They scatter people everywhere. See, now that is bearing some fruit because you've got Jews, all over the known world. Now, the Persians say you guys can go home, so now they got their homeland, but then in addition to that, they got synagogues in all these cities. All these places have synagogues. Then you got Gentiles attracted to synagogues, but it's no good because it's in Hebrew. Now you've got the Bible translated into the Greek language, so now there is an opportunity for them to actually read God's Word and become God-fearers and understand what the Old Testament has to say. So again, this is so profound, and it all kind of began back in the 8th and 9th century when God sent them into captivity. Finally, the last one. Rome created the most advanced transportation system the world had ever seen. So, once again, we go back and we look at the emergence now of the Roman Empire. The Old Testament will close, the Old Testament period, and then the between the Testament period will be with the Roman Empire emerging in the 1st century BC. And when the New Testament opens, 1st century AD, the Romans are the dominant world power. And they had their own style of doing things. They were very effective at what they did. And so this map kind of shows you can see the white lines that and the yellow lines. All of this is showing us the navigation lanes on the sea and the roads on land that they created to facilitate movements of people and facilitate travel. And this just changed the life of everybody, and especially when you think of Jesus traveling around and the apostles and their movements, how this facilitated the life of the church and the spread of the gospel. We can think of how the gospel spread if we go back to just look at the book of Acts. First 7 chapters there in Jerusalem and Judea, and then the gospel spreads out through Samaria, up through Phoenicia, points north. Then it's going to arrive in Syria, further north. You've got the city of Antioch. And so the gospel, chapter by chapter, by Acts 13, we're at Antioch. And so it's gradually moving. But from there, there's going to be a trigger that's going to cause it to go everywhere. And these transportation opportunities are going to facilitate that. Because we have Paul's first missionary journey, which basically he covered a relatively small area. It's big by some standards because he's walking and riding ships and, it's hardship, but it's not a large area compared to his second missionary journey when he launched out and made it all the way over to Greece. I mean, that's just incredible. How could he have done that with no Roman roads and no navigation developed? So now the gospel is spreading because this has taken place. And then the third missionary journey, where he covers some of the same old territory, ends back up at Jerusalem. And then finally, he's going to travel by sea. It's an arduous, dangerous journey with shipwrecks and everything, but nevertheless, it's possible. This is all being facilitated by how God has arranged for the Roman government to do all this amazing stuff. So these are some examples then of how God works with his left hand to prepare the world for what is going on, what he intends to do. We can see that by 100 AD, how far the church has spread, and then by 500 AD, and again, this is all a byproduct of all these other factors and other things that have been taking place. So let me just make a couple of comments. Think about the day of Pentecost. These arrows represent all the groups of people that are named in Acts chapter 2 that showed up in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Think about that for a moment. Who are these people? Yeah, Jews from the diaspora and God-fearers, proselytes, Gentile proselytes to Judaism are there as well. Okay, and we see this happening. They too want to buy into the feast. This is a feast, the Pentecost feast. You want to be in Jerusalem. If you're a Jew, you want to be in Jerusalem. If you are a Gentile God-fearer, you want to be in Jerusalem because you have now bought into the law and the Old Testament, so you want to be there as well. So this represents just, might be the tip of the iceberg. He didn't name every place people came from, but he listed these. Okay, and so this is amazing then to think of how this could have happened apart from all these other things taking place. So now they show up for the launch of the church, and we can see they're all converging on Jerusalem. This is all the results of all the stuff that's been happening. And imagine what the day of Pentecost would have been like if we didn't have all this other stuff happening. And so it's fascinating then to think about how, because God orchestrated all these other things, then as a result we have the day of Pentecost, where you've got thousands and thousands of people coming from all over the known world to hear the gospel preached in Jerusalem by Peter. All right, so that's a little bit of an overview of the left hand of God. Yeah, it is a lot, yeah. And the PowerPoint's available if you want to go over it and review it and preach on it this Sunday, you know. But any last thoughts, any questions on this before we conclude?
Just a small thing as far as the navigation routes. They didn't have very much prior to Roman Empire. Did they have much in the way of navigation?
Well, they had some, yeah. I mean, the Persians had a huge fleet. Yeah, and so that's how they were coming against Greece. So some nations had more than others, but it was gradually evolving. So it wasn't just that there were ships. Now there's actually an understanding of how to navigate the whole Mediterranean Sea. And if you read the trip that Paul took from Jerusalem to Rome, Acts 27, Acts 28, it's fascinating. All the different ports they stopped at, which side of certain islands they had to go on, how the weather came up and affected them. There were so many issues, and all of this was part of the seamanship that was part of how the Romans understood to navigate the Mediterranean. Anything else? Yeah. So our big question as we leave tonight is, what's God doing in 2017? Yeah, what's that left hand up to?
Sure, in like 700 years we'll figure it out. We'll look back and be like, "That's so obvious."
Yeah. Well, you just wonder, who could see it back then?
Right.
But now we have the privilege of having the record of all that happened, so we should be a little wiser about this stuff, it seems.
They're going to make the transition that the right hand of God is working through the Israelites and such as it now works through the church.
Yeah, yes. Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, well, let me pray. Father, thank you for the time we've had tonight and for this chance to just review how your hand works. Because you are the God of mission, you're the God of history. It's your story. We praise you that you are a God who intends to bless all the families of the earth. And you're so powerful and so amazing that you are able to use all of the things that are available to conspire together to accomplish your purposes. Father, may we be wise today. May the church of Jesus Christ be wise to discern what you are doing and to be able to respond appropriately. You are the God who orchestrates times and epochs, and you are the one who brings up and elevates kings, and you demote them. We want to trust you for that and trust your wisdom that in all of those